Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, and welcome to the first installment of my Deep Purple series, where today I'll be discussing Deep Purple Mark I, which of course includes the albums Shades of Deep Purple, the debut, the second album, The Book of Taliesyn, and the third self-titled Deep Purple record. This is my favorite one. So yeah, Deep Purple Mark I, very under-discussed, almost mysterious sort of era in Deep Purple's history. They don't necessarily start off at the same bang as Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath, but it's a very interesting period in their career. There's certainly lots to talk about. It's quite interesting seeing, the multiple directions that they could have taken as they're trying to find their sound around this time. And yeah, it's just an interesting little nugget of Purple history. The lineup, of course, is John Lord playing the organ, Ritchie Blackmore on guitar, Ian Paice on drums, Nick Simper on bass, and Rod Evans on vocals. And this lineup is very short-lived. They make 3 albums, but it's in a very short span of time. The seeds of the band are kind of sown in, kind of mid to late 1967. The band finally coalesces, kind of early 68, like March, April 68. And by June of 1969, this lineup of the band is over, and they have a big lineup change, and the rest, of course, is history. But yeah, like I said, it's a fascinating period. The way that the band forms in and of itself is a pretty interesting story. It's not your typical situation where a group of guys get together and and start a band. In the case of Deep Purple, the beginnings can be traced to a guy named Chris Curtis, who was a drummer for a band called The Searchers. Now, I'm not super familiar with The Searchers, but I know that this guy essentially forms Deep Purple. He has this idea. He approaches a management company, specifically a guy named Tony Colletta, with a proposition regarding a band called Roundabout. And the idea is that this band will have a constantly rotating cast of musicians that would come in and out of the band, kind of like cars go in and out of a roundabout. And this is, mid to late 60s, so of course, anything goes. And Tony Colletta, this management company, likes the idea, so they say, okay, yeah, this sounds great, we'll give you some money, we'll let you, get this project off the ground and whatnot, and, everything seems to be all good. So the first musician that Chris Curtis decides to bring into the band is John Lord. Well, I think it was his flatmate or something like that. There was some kind of connection. And then the other musician he wanted was a British guitarist living in Germany at the time, working in Germany as a session musician by the name of Ritchie Blackmore. So Chris Curtis gets these two together. Everything appears to be going really well. The management likes the idea. Blackmore and Lord are on board. Everything seems to be good. And then suddenly Chris Curtis discovers drugs. And he kind of goes on a little acid trip or whatever and essentially disappears and abandons his own project, his own baby. So, without this idea person, the founding person, things appear to be, have fallen through. However, this management company, Tony Colletta, must have seen something between Blackmore and Lord. So they approach John Lord and say, hey, if you're still interested, we're prepared to, give you some financial assistance, let you record an album, if you guys wanted to put a band together. So naturally, they took that opportunity and assembled a band. The first recruit, I believe, is Nick Simper on bass. He was playing in the same band that Lord was playing in 1967, which was called the Flower Pot Men. They were the backing group for a vocal group called The Garden, so kind of a funny concept, Garden, the Flower Pot Men. So he's brought in on bass, and then there's another band that they were familiar with called The Maze, which featured Rod Evans on lead vocals and Ian Paice on drums. So, obviously, they heard Ian Paice has got this great swingy kind of drum feel, so they want him in the band. Rod Evans, he's a very capable singer, so he's brought in as well. And, at this point, we're kind of like, March or April of 68, and this is the point when the first lineup of Deep Purple is kind of formally together and operating as a band. And what's really interesting about this whole period, the whole Mark I period, is the, you know, I don't know if you could call him like the de facto leader, but certainly the most dominant member of the group is John Lord at this point. You know, Richie Blackmore's got lots of moments where he kind of like showcases his talent, but you know, Lord is very much the representative of the band. A lot of the interviews from the early times, they tend to talk to John Lord, and even on, you know, the first album cover, John Lord is in the center of the photograph, which is interesting. I think it kind of gives the Mark I era, you know, a unique sort of a feel. And I think that's what makes the Mark I so interesting, is that you kind of have the established, you know, like I said, de facto leader or dominant member with John Lord, and then as the albums progress, Richie Blackmore becomes a little bit more dominant as well. And I don't think it was so much of a power struggle, but there's two different directions that the band seems to be heading in. On one hand, you've got John Lord, who's kind of pushing this classical meets rock sort of thing, and Richie Blackmore, who just wants to, you know, take things to the heaviest possible level. And in the end, Blackmore was right, and they achieved their greatest success when they followed Blackmore's lead. But in the meantime, we're still talking about Mark I. So in May of 1968, they go in and they record their debut album, Shades of Deep Purple. Overall, this is, you know, to me, it's not an astounding debut. You know, it's certainly not the Court of the Crimson King. It's not Black Sabbath's debut. You know, it's a band trying to find themselves. But there's all kinds of interesting styles in here. A lot of it is very much still rooted in the 60s. But I find it interesting because they really wear their influences on their sleeve. You know, Richie always talks about really liking Vanilla Fudge. They're an American band who is quite famous for doing these radical reworkings of cover songs, and that's something that they do on this album. About half the album is cover versions, which is fine. You know, again, I don't think they really had the time to put a huge amount of original material together, so they just kind of did these interesting cover versions. You know, obviously Cream would have been a big influence around this time. You know, later in 1968, they would actually tour with Cream. They had opened for them on the Farewell Tour through the States, which is kind of interesting. Obviously, Jimi Hendrix is a huge influence on Blackmore at this point. There's a few songs on here that really demonstrate that. Another band that I'm sure they were listening to quite a bit would be the Nice. I'm sure John Lord was paying attention to what Keith Emerson was doing in the Nice with the whole, you know, Abe, you know, both being organ players, playing the big Hammond, but, you know, that whole classical thing, that thing of you know, trying to introduce classical elements to, you know, rock music at the time, that has to be from the Nice, or maybe it was Lord's own inclination, but in any case, it's an interesting thought, because the Nice were around in '67, I believe. Their first album was already out at this point. But, yeah, like I said, you know, it very much is a mixed bag. You know, you can see their influences, but it is certainly an interesting run of songs on here. You know, I mentioned the album cover. It's cool that John Lord is in the center picture, but pretty basic, really. It's nothing too exciting. Incidentally, just for random interest, I do have the... There's a series of reissues that came out, I think, in the early 2000s, and they had this like stupid thing where they'd have like this background, and then the actual album cover was really small, but you could just flip it over, and you know, I'd rather see the proper album cover on my jewel cases, so I flipped them all over to make it look better. Anyway, we'll chat about the songs on this album real quick. So it opens with "And the Address." Opens with an instrumental, interesting way to bring things to bring Deep Purple into the world. And it's a cool little song. You know, it's got this kind of long, you know, churning organ sound. We're introduced to like a rhythmic motif that is used on the album almost a little bit too much, I think, where we get that boom, da-dum, dum, da-dum, dum. And they introduce like almost half the songs on the album with that same rhythm, which gets pretty tiring. But and the Address goes into this kind of cool little, fairly intricate theme that bum 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 da 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 dun 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 bum bum, and it kind of goes into this, you know, bouncy sort of late '60s psychedelic groovy thing. And that intro is actually quite a bit more complex than what Deep Purple would do later, which is kind of interesting. And yeah, it's all right. I mean, I always, there's certainly a psychedelic sort of vibe to this song. I think, most of this album I would consider to be kind of, you know, psychedelic pop with a bit of an edge. There's moments where it gets heavy, but I think edgy is a better word than heavy for a lot of the stuff on this album. But yeah, and the address is cool. I think even though it is very much a rock instrumental, I think it is borrowing from the kind of bebop tradition where you'd have like a main theme or a head, then you have some solos, and you repeat the main theme, some more solos, and that's pretty much exactly what you get here. You do get that cool kind of little intricate part, and then we're introduced to both Ritchie Blackmore and John Lord as soloists, which is quite cool. And then, of course, many, many, many years later, they would re-record this song with the lineup that features Steve Morse and Don Airey, which is kind of cool. I think that version's probably technically a little bit better, but this is the original one, the first song released on a Deep Purple album. So then we move on to track 2. Far and away the most famous song by Mark I is Hush, which is a cover of a guy named Joe South. And this is the first time where we kind of see them reworking cover material. It's definitely much more energetic than the original. I've heard the original a couple of times, and the essence of the song is there. But I think the big thing that stands out with this one is that bass line. I love that groovy bass line, bum 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 bum, which is really cool. And this of course was a decent hit in the U.S. It's kind of funny. I mean, most bands in the UK at this time, where it was always, a struggle to break the US market. And of course, they'd establish themselves in the UK, and then they'd work, as hard as they could to get involved in the States. But in the case of Deep Purple, they break into the US market like instantaneously with Hush, which is kind of interesting. And it's a great song. Their version I think is the most popular. It's the one that anyone that knows the song Hush probably knows Deep Purple's version. Good showcase for Rod Evans' vocals. I like it's real catchy chorus, that na 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 na. Yeah, and it's good. Well-deserved hit. And it's funny, because they had that success in the States so early on with Hush, they virtually ignored touring in England. Like, they did sporadic dates here and there, but as soon as they had that Hush single in the States, it was all about touring the States, really. And I think they only did 2. There was one really big tour at the start, and then there was a second tour that kind of goes into 1969, but and then like kind of sporadic dates in the UK and Europe. But yeah, Hush is a great song. Moving on. Track 3, One More Rainy Day. This is very much like super deeply rooted in the 60s. This is very much just a pop song. We kind of see John Lord being the dominant member here. It's very much led by the organ. Not too much to say about it, really. It's a pretty standard, psychedelic pop song from the 60s. I almost hesitate to call it psychedelic. It's the closest they come to writing like a Beatles sort of a song. It almost makes me laugh, some of the vocals there, that ba 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 ba. It's so not characteristic of Deep Purple, but it's an interesting little nugget. It's cool that it exists, but I guess I don't really have that much to say about it. It's pretty light for the most part. We move on to track 4. Now, this is a segue. We got essentially 2 tracks. One is called Prelude Happiness. Now, this is an original composition. This is where we start to see John Lord toying with that classical sort of thing. And it's pretty good. I like the main theme. Good showcase for the organ. We have that stupid dun 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 dun, that intro again, which the chords match. The chords go with like the organ melody, but it's hearing that same rhythm over and over again on the album doesn't do it any favors. But yeah, Happiness is a really cool, instrumental workout. I don't think it works so well with the song that it's built around, which is I'm So Glad. It's a cover of the Cream, a cover of the Cream version of this song. I've never been fond of this song. I find it very repetitive. It's, I suppose it's fairly iconic for the times in the 60s, but Yeah, I don't think it really works here. Although it is kind of cool when Happiness reprises kind of halfway through. Like it doesn't quite fit because Happiness has this sort of intense classical thing, and then when Blackmore first comes into the main riff, or the main chords, um, it feels like the intro doesn't match the actual song itself. But it's interesting. It shows them searching. They're trying to figure out what they want to do, and I think they're attempting to do the Vanilla Fudge thing here by having a core cover song and then ornamenting it with instrumental stuff. But yeah, again, certainly not a highlight. And we then flip the record over if we were listening to vinyl, of course, and we get Mandrake Root. This to me is the highlight of the album. This song actually has probably, not counting Hush. This is an original, by the way. This one actually did get quite a bit of longevity in the Deep Purple set lists. They played the main part of the song in the early Mark II days with Ian Gillan on vocals. Ian Gillan does a much better job. It's much heavier, much more intense. But the instrumental section towards the end, where we kind of get these trading solos between Lord and Blackmore, it kind of just goes into this vamp. Ian Pace is grooving away on the toms. We get this kind of thumping, bass line. It's almost, again, this is kind of a nice thing. It almost reminds me of Blue Rondo a la Turk, the Dave Brubeck cover that the Nice was doing. And this is kind of Deep Purple doing their own version of it. But yeah, it's really cool. The main song itself is certainly an ode to Foxy Lady. There's a couple of cool riffs that they put in there, like the bum bum bum. Oh wait, no, not that. I just did end the address. The main riff. Boom doom boom boom doom do 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 do. Again, much heavier when they did this live, and especially with Mark II. But the main riff is certainly Foxy Lady. Bum bum dum ba-dum bum dum ba-dum dum dum. And that's fine. Again, they're wearing their influences on their sleeves. But like I said, the big part about Mandrake Root is the instrumental section, the second half, the instrumental second half. That's the Blue Rondo a la Turk thing. But the coolest part of it actually is the lines that the unison lines that Lord and Blackmore do. That and that would be a staple for it goes at least all the way to Mark III. Mark III would do that section. I'm not sure if Mark IV did it with Tommy Bolin, but that I think that was kind of represented the climax or the highlight of their kind of improv sections. Right through the 70s there. So that's really cool that little section of Mandrake Root has such longevity in the live set, and rightfully so, because it is really cool. Studio version is extremely polite, obviously. When they would do it later on, it was much more intense, and after they dropped the main song part of Mandrake Root, the instrumental part would be attached to Space Truckin', and that's famously on Made in Japan. So yeah, Mandrake Root, I think, is the highlight of the album. Great stuff. Moving on. Track 6, the second song on side 2, is Help, cover of the Beatles song. Now, this is the only other cover that I think really works other than Hush. Like Hush, obviously, that's a fantastic song. But Help, I think they do a really good job of making this song their own. It's slowed down. It's much more moody. I really love the long intro with just those little arpeggiated chords from Blackmore. But yeah, it's a much more somber version than the Beatles version for sure. And I think this really highlights Rod Evans. I think Rod Evans does a great job on singing Help. This is probably his peak performance on the first album. And yeah, it's really good. Not typical of Deep Purple, obviously, but it's a cool cover. It's a nice reworked version of a very famous song. We move on to track 7, which is another original, Love Help Me. This is the other one that I think is like aggressively 60s. One More Rainy Day and Love Help Me are the very 60s ones. I think Love Help Me is considerably better. We get a bit more Blackmore influence on here with the kind of, that I think fairly technical riff for the time, that it's kind of got that fast-paced chugging rhythm, and that I think there's some DNA that ends up going into the classic Mark II period. You can trace that style to a song like Love Help Me. But But yeah, the melody is very, very 60s. You know, that real quick chorus. I need love, love help me. That's so that's very 1968 for sure. But it's okay. Yeah, it's you know, one of the decent originals on the album, and it's cool. It deserves to be on here. Deserves its accolades. And then we finish off. The final song on the album is a very extended version of Hey Joe. Of course, very famously done by Jimi Hendrix. This is kind of a bizarre version, though. They're kind of doing the same thing. They're trying the same thing they did with I'm So Glad, and that we have this sort of classical instrumental that's kind of, you know, at the beginning, kind of interwoven into the song itself. I don't think it quite works, though, to be totally honest. You know, the classical section it's almost kind of like a bolero type thing. Dun 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 dun. Great showcase for Lord, but I just feel again it doesn't quite match the blues of Hey Joe. I find it very jarring when it goes from the classical bit to the Hey Joe bit. If it was just Hey Joe, it'd be, you know, pretty decent. But even then, like the version of Hey Joe is pretty much a straight run through of the Hendrix version. So. You know, overall, it's okay. You know, not the best version of Hey Joe in the world, but again, it's cool that it's there. Wraps up the first album, and that is Shades of Deep Purple, the edgy psychedelic pop of the debut. So, like I said, obviously they got pretty much instant success in the U.S., so the record company wanted to capitalize on that. This was recorded in May, and by August of 1968, they were back in the studio recording the follow-up, The Book of Taliesyn. Now this is where it starts to get a little more interesting. I think, you know, I think these three albums are exponentially better. They all get better and better as they go along, and you know, this is an interesting thing in that we see, you know, I would describe this a little less psychedelic and probably a little bit more proggy. Again, you know, this is an era where you know, the Moody Blues are around. You got Procol Harum around. You know, there's definitely the prog thing is in its infancy, but it's around, and I think they're trying to capitalize on that to a certain extent. It's kind of funny. I think it's a great album cover, by the way. I think, you know, there's just so much going on, very dense. You know, there's lots to look at. I like the whole chessboard thing. Yeah, it's and funnily enough, that the guy that wrote this was also named John Lord. No relation, but kind of a funny coincidence. John Vernon Lord, I think is his name. It's on here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. John Vernon Lord, kind of very subtly etched into the bottom there, just above this chicken. And yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's funny how they kind of present this as a concept album, but it's not a concept album. It was just a bunch of songs, really. But again, they were. I think that was just how they were trying to market it, right? They saw this proggy thing happening, so, you know, it all kind of went into marketing it. But I think there's an element of it was very rushed. I think although the recording time it took a little bit of time. I think they were probably touring in between, but the recordings between August and October of '68. So I would assume there was definitely a lot of touring going on in between. But yeah, like I said, it's a little bit more proggy, a little less psychedelic. Still got a lot of covers on here. But I think it's a definite improvement from the debut, and it's got some interesting stuff. It opens with the track "Listen, Learn, Read On," and this kind of starts the tradition of Deep Purple opening their albums with like a real, you know, a barnstorm or something very, very in your face, immediate, and intense. It's not as heavy as the Mark II stuff, but it does start with a bang. We get that little lead in from Ian Pace, tap tap, and then the riff, tap tap, da 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 boom, da 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 da. Really cool riff. I think that's fantastic, and the song itself is quite frantic. You know, it's weird to compare it, but I almost think of it being kind of like almost like a Mr. Bungle in terms of how quickly the genres are kind of changing. Like it stops and starts, and there's, you know, quick little slow parts. There's like that riff comes in a whole bunch of times, and yeah, it's a interesting song. It's got a bass solo in it, which is kind of cool. One thing that I don't think really works on this track is Rod Evans' vocals. You know, again, this is, you know, late 1968, so I guess I don't know if they're just trying to be psychedelic and trippy or whatever, but the spoken word vocals are kind of awkward and they're kind of hilarious at times. There's a few moments where there is some unintentional humor. There's one line, it's right after the bass solo, and then, you know, the organ gets all pensive, and it's, 3 times I've been born. I know this through meditation. And he says it so intensely, and then the riff comes back, and it ends up being unintentional comedy. But like I said, on the whole, I think it is a really cool song. I like I do like the musical arrangement. I like how it's all over the place. I like how it's got, you know, some dynamics. There's fast bits, slow bits. And even at the very end, Rod Evans does one of it. He does a laugh. It's not as good as Ian Gillan's laugh, but, you know, he's trying. He's you know, they're all trying. They're all looking for what they're after, I suppose. But overall, a good way to open up the album. Track 2, we get Wring That Neck. This to me is a much better instrumental than And the Address. This is much more high energy. This is almost kind of got like it's got a jazzy swing to it. I love that main riff. It's a really cool. Again, it's a head. It's like a main theme that you get in bebop jazz, but it is kind of a fast-paced shuffle more than anything. Another great showcase for particularly Blackmore, hence the title "Wring That Neck." Although it was titled "Hard Road" in the U.S. because "Wring That Neck" was too violent for the U.S. in 1968. Isn't that funny? But yeah, Wring That Neck has a pretty long history. That was one that ended up going into the Mark II set list for a little bit. I think because Mark II, they didn't do too much material from Mark I. I don't think Gillan was suited to sing a lot of the Mark I stuff. So Wring That Neck was a great way to fill in the set list and just do like these crazy 20-minute jams between Blackmore and Lord. And yeah, it's really cool. I like that Wring That Neck an awful lot. Again, it's so funny that it was considered too violent for the States. I mean, it should be pretty obvious listening to the track that the neck that he's referring to is a guitar neck, but you know, it was a different time, a different era. Interesting, you know, concerns or whatever. But we move on to track 3. We got Kentucky Woman. This is the first cover of the album. This is a Neil Diamond song, probably the most well-known song on the album. This one pops up on quite a few compilations from Deep Purple. I think it was released as a single. I think it achieved some degree of chart success in the US. You know, it didn't do anything in the UK, like probably because they didn't really tour the UK. They just did sporadic shows. But none of these albums sold too well in the UK until after the fact, when they became, you know, artifacts of historical interest. But yeah, the track Kentucky Woman, I think it's okay. You know, good heavy track. You know, in a lot of ways, this is like a Hush follow-up. Obviously, it's like the next single that they released, but you can tell that that's kind of the vibe they're going for. But it's got a cool riff. I think I like the riff that they put into it. The down, 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 down. Rod Evans puts in a real good performance, and yeah, it's a good song. Well done. Track 4, we kind of repeat the formula from Shades of Deep Purple, and then we get another cover with that's kind of ornamented by some classical stuff that was composed by Lord. 4A is called Exposition. I think this is much better than any of the kind of classical stuff that Lord was composing on the first album. Exposition gives us much better clue as to the direction they were going to go a little bit later on when they got heavier. And again, I you know, maybe this is just Lord, you know, following his own muse, but I hear a Keith Emerson influence there, especially for those, you know, really intense part. That's a great part. I think that works really, really well. Big fan of Exposition. Probably the strongest thing on the first side, in my opinion. And this serves as the intro to another Beatles cover, We Can Work It Out. A little more high energy than the last Beatles song they did with Help. You know, I think the riff is a little bit more suited to Richie. And it's okay. You know, again, I feel like the intro is so much more intense than the song itself, so I think there's a bit of a mismarriage there. But overall, I think this is a better medley than Happiness into I'm So Glad. For one, just because I don't really like it, I'm So Glad. And We Can Work It Out, it's a good song. That wraps up the first side, pretty decent. We flipped the record over, if we were listening to vinyl, of course, and we get track 5, Shield. I think this is my favorite thing on the album because it's totally unique. Not only is it unique within the context of Deep Purple's career, but it's unique in that I can't really compare the song Shield to anything else. This is something, I would say it's a little bit more proggy, but it doesn't really sound like any other prog bands at the time either. It's notably not very heavy. We just kind of get this, kind of metronomic cross-stick groove from Ian Pace. And the arrangement is quite sparse. There's really cool little, themes on guitar and on the piano. I really like Blackmore's theme there, that do 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 do, and then that gives way to Lord's theme, that which is just a bizarre little melody. That single note, well, it's not a single note melody, but it's and it's not staccato either, but it's this spacey melody, that doom 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 doom. That last note is so intriguing. Pretty cool. I like the verses. I like the chords that Laura's hitting on the piano there, and yeah, it's such a unique song. I also really, Lord does this kind of cool percussive thing on the organ. It almost sounds like it sounds like, a strange kind of bongo or something like that. It's very percussive, but it's just Lord kind of hitting away at the organ. I think that's a really cool little addition. Yeah, you got to check out Shield. I mean, like I said, it doesn't represent any Deep Purple. It's not really representative of Deep Purple Mark I or any Deep Purple for that matter. But it doesn't sound like anything else. It's this really unique, little gem that's kind of buried in all this, obscure Mark I history. So Shield is great. We move on to track 6, Anthem. This is a song that I'm not particularly super fond of, although it is pretty important in context of the story here. It is essentially, a ballad. Kind of cool in the fact that we got Ritchie doing some acoustic guitar, something that he very rarely does up until, he does Blackmore's Night in the late 90s. But the most notable thing about Anthem is the symphonic arrangement that happens during the bridge. And this is kind of the first inkling that we see of John Lord, probably working his way towards the concerto for group and orchestra, which gets done in 1969. And the classical arrangement is really cool. I think Ritchie does a really good job of intertwining his guitar lines with the orchestral stuff. And yeah, it's in that sense, it is certainly an important song. And it's well written. One thing I will say is that I feel they've escaped that overly 60s sound that's on some of the songs on Deep Purple. Like this sounds a little bit more I guess modern for the time. Well, we're in 68, still the 60s, but yeah, Anthem, it's a good song. Not one of my favorites on the album, but I recognize its importance. And then we get to track 7. This is the most proggy thing on the album, River Deep, Mountain High. This is another cover. This is, of course, Ike and Tina Turner song, but very, very radically reworked. It's a huge 10-minute thing. Very much kind of represents the peak of their progginess at this time. We have this interesting. It's kind of like a little rearrangement of the 2001 Space Odyssey music. And I think that's really, really cool. I think that, I spoke about Hey Joe earlier and how like they try to marry this classical thing with a classic song, and it doesn't seem to work. It does, the distance, when they jump from the classical sections to the song sections, it's a little bit too jarring. But River Deep, Mountain High is much more successful in this. I think they interweave those Space Odyssey themes with the actual cover, the Ike and Tina Turner song. I think those two elements are interwoven much better, and it's a much more integral piece. But it's great. It's got some really, really great dynamics, some really great highs, when that chorus comes in, that doon 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 is really cool. And I think this is probably a highlight of the band's set in these early days. I know they played it quite a bit. There was an edited version that I think was released as a single in the States. It didn't really go too far. I mean, I think, the albums were less and less successful. Even though the quality of the albums goes up, the sales were kind of going down, probably as a result of them putting too much focus on the States. But In any case, it had to happen the way it happened, otherwise it wouldn't get Mark II. So yeah, River Deep Mountain High, another real, definitely a highlight of the album for me. Yeah, great way to wrap it up, and very, very, very good song, and a good way to wrap up another intriguing album. Now, this leads us to the self-titled Deep Purple album. This is really, really good. This is almost, this is as close as you could come to, if Mark I has a classic album, this is it. Which is kind of funny because you never see songs from this album pop up on any compilations or anything like that. There really isn't any hits on this album. But as a through listen, I think it's really, really good. What I find most interesting about this album is that we can see these two possible paths that Purple were going to take. On one hand, John Lord, who has, up to this point been, the most dominant member, he's really pushing this, orchestral, classically influenced direction. But we really start to see Blackmore making his presence known on this album. We start to get songs that could conceivably be played by Mark II. I think there wasn't, but I think one song was played by Mark II from this album, but it didn't last too long. But there's other songs on here that I would imagine I could totally see Ian Gillan singing, and it would sound great. But yeah, I think, in terms of the progginess, I think it's probably a little less proggy than Book of Taliesyn, although the peak of their progginess comes on the last track on here. But yeah, it definitely shows them pushing in that heavy direction as well as that classical direction, and it's cool seeing those two elements kind of, I guess, converging at this point. I don't think there was really too much friction between Lord and Blackmore. They both just had very definite ideas, and so this album was recorded in early '69, so it's like January to March of '69. So this is right when Zeppelin debuts, and I think that had a huge impact on Ritchie Blackmore. Obviously, he hears Zeppelin coming out with this really heavy blues sound. They achieve instantaneous success, and I think that's when Blackmore says, no, we really got to pursue this heavy rock thing. Although they don't do it in an exclusively blues context the way that Zeppelin did, but that's for the next video to discuss, of course. The album cover is fantastic. This is a famous piece of art. I think it's called what's it called? The Garden of Earthly Pleasures or something like that. I probably have that wrong. Someone can correct me. I really like the cover. I think it's it's very dark and it's very weird. There's all this odd stuff going on, like this poor soul getting eaten by this mud monster thing, this giant bird. The band is sort of interwoven into the cover there, just kind of looking around at all these awful things. Garden of Earthly Delights, is that what it's called? I don't know. Someone will correct me in the comments, or I'll look it up when I'm done this video and go, I was such a fool. But yeah, we'll talk about the tracks here. So right off the hop, we get Chasing Shadows. And we hear that heavy guitar-oriented sound right away. We also get a very cool drum performance by Ian Pace. He's essentially doing it's a real basic rhythm. It's just it's a double paradiddle placed between two different sound sources, so a high and a low tom, but you get that. Which is cool. There's all kinds of percussive overdubs, which gives it this really kind of tribal feel, and it's got a very insistent march. But I love that riff. It's super basic, but in tandem with that tribal drum part, that I think Rod Evans. This is probably my favorite Rod Evans moment. Full stop. I really like the melody on here. Chasing shadows over my wall with myself oddly sleeping. I think it's really, really good. One of my favorite Mark I songs, to be honest. And it doesn't really get talked about that much, but I think it's great. Blackmore's guitar playing really does mature around this time as well. I haven't talked too much about his guitar playing on the earlier albums. It's very good, but I feel like he's really kind of honing in on his style, and I think the guitar solo on here is really good. We also get a great organ solo that happens, just over that percussive bit, which sounds really great. And yeah, it's a good song. Very awkward ending. I'm not sure how it ended in the studio, but it sounds like they just cut the tape and then that's just the end of it. But great opening track. Like I said, one of my favorite Mark I songs. I'll always be a big fan. Best Rod Evans performance. Yeah, I've said it all. We move on to track 2, Blind. Now, this is very much a John Lord thing. He's doing the harpsichord. This is another song I really, really like. Again, another unique thing in the Deep Purple catalog. You know, it is, you know, for one thing, it's got the harpsichord thing going on. But it is very much a ballad, but it's pretty high energy. It's got a really bouncy drum part to it. And yeah, I think that main theme that we get on the harpsichord, the one that comes in after every chorus, that doodle 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 doodle, I think that part is really, really strong. Great showcase for Lord as a whole. The end is very, very dramatic. That's one of those kind of proggy moments where it's one of those endings that just keeps getting more and more and more intense, and then finally makes its way to the end. Yeah, I think it's really good, and again, pretty unique. There really isn't any other Deep Purple songs like this. And it certainly, you know, demonstrates that you know, they're not wearing their influences on their sleeve as obviously as the previous 2 albums. You know, now they are finding something that's a little bit more them. So yeah, Blind is great. I'm a big fan of that one. Track 3, we get the only cover on the album. So the last 2 albums are like kind of evenly split between originals and covers. By the time we get to the self-titled, you know, they're definitely moving away from doing the Vanilla Fudge thing of doing these reworked covers. But it's a Donovan song. The song is La Leña. And it's really good. This is you know, much more dynamic piece. It's very soft. You know, if Blind is like a power ballad, this is more of a traditional ballad. I think it's really good. You know, the guitar and the organ interplay on particularly the beginning. Definitely, you can kind of hear Child in Time. You can hear, you know, the all the ingredients for bits of Child in Time can be found in La Leña. I think Rod Evans does a, you know, pretty heartfelt, genuine performance on that one, which is really good. I love the keyboard solo. I love the organ solo. It gets very jazzy. We hear, you know, Ian Pace kind of doing some proper jazz. You know, Pacey's always been a jazzy drummer. Like he's a rock drummer first and foremost, but he's a rock drummer that plays with a swing. You know, he breaks the rules in that regard. But the solo in La Leña, he kind of plays straight jazz for a little bit, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, good song. You know, decent for the only cover. And it kind of helps the album flow quite well. It gives it that through listen feel, which is good. And it leads us to track 4, which is really just an intro to The Painter. But track 4 is called Fault Line. This is them experimenting in the studio a little bit. We get reversed organ and reversed cymbals, kind of creating this, you know, menacing, you know, rhythm. And then we got a really cool bass line. It's a great little highlight for Nick Simper. I really like the bass line on here with that. And then the bass line, you know, I don't think Nick Simper was ever opposed to going heavy, but I think there's other reasons why he was eventually out of the band. But it's kind of unfortunate. It kind of sucks for Nick, but we needed Roger Glover to make the whole thing happen. So, you know, all things happen for a reason, as they say. Well, Fault Line is a cool little piece of studio experimentation, and it serves as a great intro to The Painter. This is a highlight on the album for me. This is where we really see Ritchie Blackmore kind of let loose. You know, if Blind was John Lord's showcase, The Painter is definitely Ritchie's. This is very much sort of like, you know, an R&B groovy kind of a thing. Another great bass line from Nick Simper as well. Boom, doom, 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 doom. Rod Evans delivers a great performance, you know, a little bit more rocky for Rod. I mean, I think there's interviews with, there's an interview with John Lord where he kind of describes Rod Evans as a little bit Tom Jones, you know, maybe a little bit Elvis-y to a certain extent. You know, he certainly didn't, I think he had the capability of it, but he didn't have the inclination to go as far as someone like Ian Gillan would, you know, as a heavy rock singer. But Rod Evans does a real good performance on The Painter, but Ritchie's the star of the show on here. There's some great guitar licks on here. We can really see him kind of developing that edgy, very crisp style that he has. Um, and yeah, it's a really good song. Solid piece of Deep Purple. And this is a song I could totally hear Ian Gillan singing. This is one where I could see Mark II doing a really good version of it. But I'm not sure if they ever played this one live. And I don't believe so. But that wraps up the first side. The album gets flipped over if we're listening to vinyl, and we get track 6, Why Didn't Rosemary. This song is it's a really good kind of a little boogie blues. I really like that harsh guitar intro, that and then we go into that little shuffle. It's a good little boogie of a tune, probably not one of the best songs on the album overall, but I find it quite funny. I love the whole concept. I guess they went to see Rosemary's Baby in the theater as a band, and they decided to write this song about why didn't Rosemary just take the pill, or why didn't Rosemary ever take the pill is the line. But I think that's a good little bit of Mark I humor. And yeah, it's a decent little song, not as good as some of the other stuff, but I enjoy it. Fits the flow of the album, and it's very good. Moving on to track 7, this is another highlight for me. I've always been a big fan of this song, Bird Has Flown. I think this is the B-side to one of the singles. I think La Leña was released as the single, I believe. I might have that wrong. But this is another one where we can really see the heavier side of Purple starting to come across. A very menacing riff too. I love how it fades in, and then I think what I enjoy the most, what I always enjoyed when I was listening to this as a kid, was how Ian Pace messes with the backbeat. Before, when the vocals aren't kicking in, he's only hitting the snare on 4. But then when the vocals kick in, he adds the backbeat to 2 and 4. And it gives the song a really quite an interesting rhythmic quality, which I think is really cool. There's parts of it that have that kind of 60s thing that the sensation is all dum da da, or not new to you. That part is very, very 60s still, but overall it's still really good. There's parts of it that kind of have that manic quality that Listen, Learn, Read On had, but probably not as aggressive as that. But I love that. But the bird, it has flown to a place on its own. Da 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 da. And then when it repeats, it just goes, the bird, it has flown, and then right back into that, which is really cool. So yeah, and I think Bird Has Flown was very briefly played by Mark II, although I haven't heard any recordings of it. I've read somewhere that Ian Gillan did sing this one, and again, I could totally see that, but shame it didn't get more airplay. It'd be cool if we had like an official live version that we could listen to, but I don't think it was played that much really. And then that leads us to the final track on the album, which is April. Now this is pretty significant. I think this, if Deep Purple, this is the closest they come to being a full-blown prog band. And I think this song is probably their most successful attempt at doing like a long-form sort of prog epic. I think it is really, really good. It took me a long time to appreciate this one because it's a really, really long stretch before we get to like the actual song itself. And the song itself, the groovy part it's only about 3 minutes long, but April as a composition is essentially, a 3-movement bit. The intro is really cool. We get Richie on the acoustic guitar again. It introduces some really nice themes. So really, good display for Lord's compositional technique as well as his performance technique. And it's really, really cool. The second movement is largely orchestral, or entirely orchestral, I should say. Again, kind of foreshadowing what Lord's working, kind of building towards with regards to the concerto, which comes out later in the year. And then finally, the third movement is the song itself. And I think, while it is quite bitty, it's not as well integrated as some of the epics that Yes would go on to do. Although this is still 1969, this is still pretty forward thinking. This is pre Court of the Crimson King here, so can't be too critical. I mean, I think the prog bands hadn't really fully established, how to put together a multi-part suite. But I think, on the whole, they do a really good job. It's really nice how the like when the song portion comes in, like the third movement at the very end, we do get some repeating themes from the first movement, which I think is really cool. And yeah, it might not be my favorite song on the album, but it is absolutely a vital song on the album. And again, it really shows us, these two possible paths that they could take at this point. On one hand, you got Richie, who wants to get heavy and do the Led Zeppelin thing, and John Lord, who wants to kind of maintain this, classical rock band direction. And we end up getting both. It's funny, like, when we move on to my next video and I talk about Mark II, I'll briefly touch on the concerto. I won't spend a huge amount of time on the concerto, but it's kind of interesting because, concerto for group and orchestra, it feels like it belongs more with the Mark I stuff than it does Mark II. It feels like, that was something that should have been done with Mark I, but by the time they performed the concerto, Ian Gillan and Roger Glover were already in the band, so it's like they kind of had to, kind of get that over with before they could fully embrace this heavy style that's Richie's trying to impose on the band. But yeah, that wraps up the studio material from Mark I. I think they would continue to tour in the States pretty heavily up until late spring of '69. And then I believe their final performance is either like the end of June or the beginning of July, and then that's the end of Mark I. I think they had already decided probably around the time that this album was recorded that they wanted to replace Rod Evans. Again, they were going for this heavy sound. Rod Evans, it's not that he wasn't capable, I just don't think he was willing to fully embrace that style. Nick Simper, I always get the feeling that he would have been on board to do, the heavy thing, but when they found Ian Gillan, I'm not sure if it was that, Gillan wanted to bring Glover on board because they were songwriting partners, or if they just wanted a change in style. Ian Pace has gone on record saying that I think he had some issues with Nick Simper's playing, but I can't hear it on the albums. I mean, like Nick Simper is a perfectly capable bass player from what I can hear, but like I said, if Nick Simper didn't leave or wasn't removed, I should say, then we wouldn't have Mark II and things would have turned out very differently. But yeah, in any case, I think that wraps up the Mark I story for you. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you made it to the end, you can hear me not say like, comment, and subscribe. I never say that because I'm not a conformist. And yeah, like I say, hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the next video. That'll probably be a little bit longer and a little more detailed because we're talking about Mark II, which is the very classic lineup that cements Deep Purple into the pantheon of rock history for all eternity. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for watching. If you made it this far, you are super cool. And yeah, we'll talk to you later. You'll see me in the future. And thanks again. Bye-bye.